Alright, hello everybody. This is going to be a tutorial on how to take this $35 Raspberry Pi and make it into a offsite backup for your Synology NAS. Basically, you can take this Raspberry Pi and put it at a friend or family member's house and hook up a hard drive to it. Then, using a VPN, automatically pull all of your critical file changes from your Synology back into the hard drive hooked up to the Raspberry Pi. You can schedule this to happen whenever you would like to. Then we will be using rsync, so you will have very little data usage and only files that have changed will get updated. This is a great and inexpensive way to ensure that if something happens to your main NAS, that your data is still backed up. This could be a robbery, fire, or even water damage. So the Raspberry Pi 4 is awesome. It's got a full gigabit Ethernet connection and 2 USB 3 ports. This means that you can get incredibly fast data transmission through this unit. One thing to note, when purchasing a hard drive for this, I would highly recommend purchasing a hard drive with its own power supply. All Raspberry Pis supply very little power over the USB bus, and so many hard drives will not work. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using a very low power SSD. This is a pretty complex tutorial, but the overall plan for this is to use a VPN connection set up from your Synology NAS to connect the Raspberry Pi back to your home network. Then set up SSH keys so that you do not have to type in your password every time you'd like to use an rsync. Finally, schedule an rsync with cron to happen every X amount of time. This way, your data will always be backed up. Another important thing we're doing here is we are using rsync natively. That means that we're actually using the SSH shell to connect between two computers. A more simple way of doing this would have been to mount the Synology drive on the actual Raspberry Pi, but that would cause a significant performance overhead because rsync looks through all the files. Instead, we're just going to be using rsync and going back to our home network. For this tutorial, I'm not going to be going over how to set up a VPN, as I've already done it in a previous video. Alright, so for this tutorial, I've already got a Raspberry Pi that I'm able to SSH into. If you do not know how to do this, I've got a couple of videos right here that will help you. Alright, so once you've hooked up your Raspberry Pi and your hard drive to your network, the first thing we're going to want to do is initialize the drive. So right now I'm doing this on a Mac, so I'm just going to SSH using terminal. If you're using a PC, go ahead and start at PuTTY. We're just going to go ahead and SSH into the Raspberry Pi. Alright, so right now our drive has not been initialized, so let's go ahead and start it up and format it for ext4. That way, it has the best compatibility with Linux. Alright, so first we're going to figure out what disks are connected with sudo fdisk list. Alright, so if we look through these first few, it's RAM and the actual operating system. But then we go down here, and here is our SSD that I hooked up. It's probably a hard drive if you're doing a backup though. And it is SDA1. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and format it using sudo fdisk, this path that we found right here. So right here, we're going to hit new, primary, 1, default, and default. So for defaults, you can just hit enter. And now it's initialized it as a Linux format. Alright, so now we're actually going to go ahead and do this by hitting W for write. Alright, since I've already actually mounted this, I'm going to have to do a sudo reboot. Alright, so now that I've rebooted, it should be uninitialized again. So we're going to do a sudo make file system -t, we'll do ext4, and the file path that we created. And just hit yes. Alright, so now we have created a file system. And now we're going to put somewhere to mount it. So we'll do it from the Pi user's home folder. As you can see, I've already got this backup here, but we'll just remove it. So now we're going to go ahead and create a backup folder in here. Make a backup folder in here with make dir backup. All right, so now let's go ahead and mount that drive to the backup folder manually this time with sudo mount, same path we were using, to. All right, and now we should be mounted into the backup folder. Let's see what happens when we go in there and try to make a file. So permission denied, that means we never gave ourselves the proper permissions. All right, so now we just need to give ourselves permissions to the backup folder by typing sudo chmod a for all plus read write, R for recursive, forgot that, and the folder name. All right, so now if we cd into it and we try to make a file, voila, we are allowed to create a file in there. All right, so now we've successfully mounted our hard drive that's plugged into our Raspberry Pi. But as soon as we reboot the Raspberry Pi, this is going to go away. So to fix this, we're going to have to put it in our fstab file to automatically mount the drive on boot up. All right, so to automatically mount this drive on boot, we're first going to have to figure out what the UID of it is. So sudo blkid. So as you can see here, these first three are the drives that are actually running the operating system. That's that SD card. But this last one right here is my actual external drive. So this is the UUID. So we're going to copy that. All right, and so now we just need to add in the fstab file to boot it up. So we're going to do sudo nano, our text editor, etc fstab. All right, so here's a list of drives that are going to be mounted as soon as you turn on your Raspberry Pi. As you can see, it's the boot and the root folder, which makes sense. So we're just going to add another line to it, and we're going to say UUID, because that's what we're using, and paste that value in. And we're going to be mounting it in the home/pi/backup folder. It's ext4. Giving defaults will give the user permission to access it. And then 0, then 2. All right, and so let's do Control O to write it, Enter to save it, Control X to exit. And we'll do a sudo mount A to test it. All right, that should have worked, but I realized it was already mounted, so we may as well just do a sudo reboot to make sure it worked. All right, let's see if it worked. All right, and it has worked. All right, and to make sure it worked, let's just do the df. All right, and as we can see here, it has successfully mounted, and we have about 455 gigabytes free. All right, and so now automatically, every time our Raspberry Pi reboots, it will mount that drive, assuming it's plugged into the Raspberry Pi. All right, so now we're going to do some steps to configure our Synology NAS. So we're going to go over and open up DSM. All right, so now that we've booted into our DSM, we're going to have to configure a couple of settings. So let's go into Control Panel. If you don't have all of these settings, you've got to go to Advanced Mode. So the first one we're going to go into is Terminal. We've got to enable SSH service. This is what we're going to be using to interface. Next, we're going to be going to File Services. And then we're going to be going right here to rsync. We're going to be enabling the rsync service. This way, we'll be able to perform the rsync from our Raspberry Pi, pulling the data from the Synology. All right, and the final thing we're going to do is go in and enable a user folders by going into User, Advanced, and enabling User Home Service. This way, when we configure our SSH keys, they will have somewhere to go without too many complications with permissions. All right, so that's it for DSM. So because we're automating this rsync task, we're going to have to enable SSH keys. Basically, instead of sending a password, you send a very special key. That way you can authenticate SSH without typing in a password, which for what we're doing is critical. as we're not going to be there to type in the password every time. All right, so on my right-hand side, we're going to have the SSH terminal for the Synology. On the left-hand side, we're going to have it for the Raspberry Pi. So we're going to SSH in. All right, so I've already got a tutorial on setting up SSH keys. It was actually my second video, but we're going to go ahead and do it right here because it's a little bit different. So we're going to do sudo nano. So we're going to edit the SSH config file. Oh, I forgot. Synology does not have nano, it has vim. But that's okay. All right, so now we're going to make sure 2 lines are uncommented here. The pub key authorization and the authorization key files. It looks like it's already been done here, so we can just exit. All right, so now we're going to generate a public and a private key for a Raspberry Pi using ssh-keygen -t RSA, and it'll save it to the default place. Enter for no passphrase. All right, so right here is my private key. This is what's used to authenticate my SSH connection. All right, so now we need to take it from my Raspberry Pi and put it on my Synology by typing ssh-copy ID and then sign in. All right, so to see if this all worked, we're going to try to SSH from my Raspberry Pi into my Synology. And look, we did not have to enter a password. This means it will automatically work without us doing anything, and that the keys were set up properly. All right, so now on our Raspberry Pi, we're going to go ahead and create a batch file that will perform an rsync from the data on the Synology and pull it on the hard drive. All right, so before we do anything, we're going to want to test the code before automating it. So we're going to be using an rsync. So I'll go into the code folder that I just created and make a file real quick. And now we're going to give that running permissions with sudo chmod. And now that should be executable. So now let's go ahead and test it. We'll just use nano real quick. All right, so first we're going to have to add our shebang. And then we'll just test real quick with an echo. And we'll save it with Control O, Enter, Control X. All right, and as you can see there, it worked. So that means we'll be able to call this and it will run whatever we need to. So let's edit it again. And this time we'll actually have it do some things. So first off, we're probably going to want it to have some kind of logging capability. So we'll go ahead and say, okay, we started the run. So this should write start and the date to a text file called log in the backup folder. Then we're going to go ahead and test the rsync. So to do this, we're going to do an rsync. So we'll do rsync A for archive, which has a bunch of settings you're probably going to want, and V for verbose. Then we're going to enter the location that we're going to be taking the files from. For us, that's going to be the Synology NAS. So first we're going to have to figure out where our folder is that we want to do it. So we're going to go back over to the Synology and go to the root directory. And as you can see, there's this volume1 folder. So cd into it. And we can see right here, there's a general folder. That's what I created. That's got my important files in it. And I chose stuff to be the important files. So we'll call it. All right, so now we're in the folder with the important stuff, right? Print the working directory to figure out where we are. So this is the folder we're going to want to be backing up. So to do an rsync over SSH, we're going to do username at IP address, / whatever that is. So make sure not to have a backslash at the end, so that way you'll have the folder stuff in there too. And where do we want to put it? And that is going to be home, pi, backup. All right, so now let's go ahead and see if that worked. We'll write it and see if we run it and what happens. All right, so I've added a ton of folders in here, so it's going to take a little while. All right, so that finally ran. I'm not actually sure why I decided to put so much data in there. I put probably 50 gigs of videos in there, so I cut it down some. But I was getting transfer rates of 80 megabytes per second, which was awesome. So that's the really nice thing about the Raspberry Pi 4 is that true gigabit Ethernet connection. Obviously doing this over VPN, you'll probably get less, but it's still a great starting place. And using rsync, if we run it again, we'll see right here that it didn't do anything because it already had all that stuff. So rsyncs only update when there's a change. So now let's see what happened in our directory, the backup. As you can see here, there's this stuff folder. And let's see what happened with the log. As we can see here, there were 2 logs. All right, so as we can see, the 2 directories are identical, which is good. Let's see what happens if we add in a new file here. So now we added in this test file. And now let's go run that backup code. And as we can see here, it found that that was new and transferred over. All right, so this means we will only be backing up things that have changed. And currently with this setup, it's a non-delete. And that's what I recommend doing unless you're going to be changing a lot of files often and worried about hard drive space on your backup. So default out of the box, rsync archive mode will only overwrite files, but if the files themselves are deleted, they will leave them in place. That's really helpful for if you accidentally delete something, but want to bring it back. All right, so now let's go ahead and add a little bit more to that log file. All right, so we're not going to need the verbose because it's not necessary. So now let's have a way to see what happens if it works. To use this, we're going to use the %. So that will run every time that this was successful. We will then run this. So we'll have a start and a finish and the same date. And we'll pipe it to the same log file. That way, if there's a success, it writes the new change. All right, and let's look at that log file. So now, if it successfully runs, it'll add a finish in there. And that's going to be the pretty simple log files that we're going to be having for this. You could add more information in here, but for this, at least you can kind of figure out when it broke. So now we've got this working and it does everything we want it to do. So every time right now we run this script, it's backing up the files, which is exactly what we want it to do. The final thing to do is to schedule it task-wise. All right, so to schedule our jobs, we're going to be using cron tab. So type cron tab-E. And so we're going to choose number 1 because I like nano. All right, and this will give us a walkthrough of how to use cron. It's a very simple setup. I would recommend giving a comment. And we basically have a bunch of options. So you can specify the minute, hour, day, month, or day of the week. Then for any time you'd like it to do it whenever, you just add a star. So for example, if you wanted it to run at midnight every night, you do 0000, because that's midnight, and then just star, star, star. That way, no matter what day or month it is, it'll run this command. We can also do it every 10 minutes. So say you wanted it to run every 10 minutes. You do any number divisible by 10, star, star. And that means anytime the value is something like 320, 340, it will run this. And so we'll run the file. And then you just Control X to exit, yes, enter. All right, now to see if it worked, we're going to do cron tab, list. And right here, it should be backing up the important files, which we've selected. All right, so now we're going to wait a few minutes and see if it runs the code. First, we're going to give it a change though. So now we've changed that test file. All right, and I'll see you in a few minutes and we'll check the log file to see if it worked. All right, I got impatient, so I decided to change it every 5 minutes. It's about to change that time. So yeah, it should be backing up right about now if we did this all correctly. So now let's go ahead and look at that log file and see if it worked. I'll give it a few seconds to make sure it did it and go. And right here, 15:05, that meant that it successfully worked. All right, so we've successfully tested it. So now let's make sure that that change got put in there. All right, and right there we can see the rsync successfully worked. All right, so now that we know that cron tab works, let's actually do a more reasonable, maybe every hour. So instead of being divisible by 5, we're just going to do at the top of every hour. So yeah. So now that should run every hour, and we'll even have our log files to make sure it all worked. This is a pretty straightforward example. Then if you're using it across the internet, I would recommend setting up a VPN. I'm not going to be going over that in this tutorial. I've already done that in a video and it's right here. But overall, this should be everything you need to get yourself going. All right, well that's all I've got for you. Feel free to leave a comment below about what videos you would like to see me make. And have a good one. Bye.